good afternoon rather, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's webinar. I'm Jodie Whedon, the Executive Director of AustCham ASEAN, and today I'll be the moderator for this for the webinar. The webinar is going to be focused on providing you with an update on the business landscape across the ASEAN region, and we'll be looking at how businesses are being impacted by the strange year that 2020 has been, and obviously the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. We'll also discuss where there might be opportunities arising for Australian businesses across the region as we aim to capitalise on the strong partnership between Australia and ASEAN. But before I start, I just want to run through a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, you may have realised everybody is on mute to avoid sound interruptions. Given the size of the audience that we have this afternoon, other than the speakers, videos are also turned off. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to make it available on both the AustCham ASEAN website and the ERIA website. So you'll be able to access that hopefully within the next 24 hours. And we'd love to encourage you to, if you don't want to watch it again, to circulate it within your networks. That would be great. The format for today's event is that we'll first hear welcome remarks from Mr. Koji Hachiyama, the Chief Operating Officer of ERIA. We'll then move to the keynote speech from Ambassador Will Nankervis, who's the Ambassador of the Australian Mission to ASEAN. Following this, we'll hear from our three panellists, who I will introduce individually along the way. After this, we'll move into a Q&A session with all of the speakers. If you have questions along the way, we will be doing live question gathering. So if you put your question in the box, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can ask questions to any of the speakers, the keynote speaker, and the panellists. So please make sure to put your questions in along the way, and we will get to them towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so let me get started by introducing Mr. Koji Hachiyama, who will provide today's welcome remarks. Mr. Koji Hachiyama started his career in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry of Japan and served in various positions, including at the Embassy of Japan in Indonesia. In the past 2 years, Mr. Hachiyama has served as the Councillor in the National Strategy Office of ICT, the Cabinet Secretariat of Japan from 2014 to 2017. He served as the Director of the IT Department in Jetro, New York, and the Head of the New York Representative Office of IPA. So thank you very much, Mr. Hachiyama. Please commence your welcome remarks.
Thank you, Jodie, and good morning and good afternoon, distinguished speakers. His Excellency Will Nankervis, Australian Ambassador to ASEAN, President of Chau, President of the Australia-ASEAN Chamber of Commerce, Dr. John Ackermann, Founding Director of the PT Mitra, Asia Lestari, and John D. Warden, Executive Director of the Australia-ASEAN Chamber of Commerce. We are delighted to have with us such a distinguished representation from Australia, a very important partner for our activities at ERIA. Let me also thank colleagues from the Australian Mission to ASEAN and the Australia-ASEAN Chamber of Commerce for their support in the organization of this webinar. And I also thank my area colleague, Intan and Julia, and all area staff to prepare this webinar. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Dear participants, welcome to the area webinar to discuss doing business in ASEAN, particularly from the perspective of Australian business. Since the beginning of the pandemic, ERIA has been developing analysis, researches, and policy advice on the economic consequences of the pandemic and the possible measures that can be put in place for a quicker economic recovery. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has severely affected ASEAN economies and the dialogue partners through the disruption to the flow of goods and services in the region's global value chain, and the collapse in demand stemming from social distancing and lockdown measures. These measures have strongly affected domestic and international business in the region. This is why understanding and analyzing the perspective of the private sector is of great importance to us, and why we are here to discuss the finding of the recent survey developed by AustCham on recent trends and dynamics of Australian business operating in the region. At the ERIA, we are also working on 2 other surveys to understand the behavior and the dynamics of business in ASEAN, the ASEAN Dialogue Partners Chambers, and we are very pleased to be able to complement this point of view with the Australian one. For one, ERIA partner with the American Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia to survey foreign firms across ASEAN, and the other survey focused on Japanese firms in ASEAN. ERIA's research has suggested that East Asian supply chains are more resilient than other regions' supply chains, and thus could be a model for the rest of the world. We believe that ASEAN could be the natural leader in the recovery from pandemic by deepening economic cooperation amongst countries under the EAS framework, which will boost business linkage throughout the region. It is important for ASEAN to sustain and develop both physical and digital connectivity within East and Southeast Asia to maintain the competitiveness of regional production network. There is also an urgent need for workable mechanisms to facilitate public-private partnerships, as many countries are still in recovery mode after a huge stimulus package during the pandemic. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, enhancing economic cooperation and providing analysis, discussion and policy advice among our region is key for us. Therefore, I look forward to this discussion, providing ideas for further economic integration within the ASEAN region and with the dialogue partners like Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hachiyama. Thank you for those warm words of welcome. I think also, I know speaking on behalf of AustCham ASEAN, it's been a pleasure working with ERIA in the last couple of months, and I know that there's lots we can do together as we look towards recovery across the region, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thank you very much. Now, turning to our keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce you all to Ambassador Nankervis. I think this is a great chance for many people in the audience to virtually meet the new ambassador. So thank you very much for agreeing to provide the keynote speech. A little bit of background about Ambassador Nankervis. He's the ambassador of the Australian mission to ASEAN and based in Jakarta. Previously, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Indo-Pacific Strategy and Regional Maritime Branch in DFAT, where his responsibilities include implementation of Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as regional maritime security issues. Ambassador Nankervis was a member of the task force that developed Australia's 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Prior to that, he headed the DFAT Iraq and Syria Task Force, and he was political counsellor at Australia's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York during Australia's term on the UN Security Council. He has also undertaken postings and short-term missions in Sri Lanka and Solomon Islands. He is very willing to answer questions during the Q&A session. So if you have questions, you feel free to post them in the chat column, as I said before. Ambassador Nankervis will stay around for the length of the webinar, and we'll be able to respond at the time. So thank you. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thanks very much, Jodie, and thanks for the warm welcome. Hi to my fellow panelists and everyone who's joined us virtually, and nice to meet you virtually. I'm really pleased to be here on a day that is still just within my first week as Australia's ambassador to ASEAN. So I'd like to touch briefly on 3 things today. The first is the importance of ASEAN to Australia. The second is the impact of COVID-19. And the third is some of the things that ASEAN is doing in response and some of the ways that Australia is lending support to those efforts. So first, the importance of ASEAN in the region to Australia. So a strong and resilient Southeast Asia is really important to Australia. As a bloc, ASEAN is our second largest trading partner. The Indo-Pacific, with ASEAN at its centre, has been the engine room for global growth for the last couple of decades. And I noticed Hachiyama-san's comments on the possibility of ASEAN driving economic recovery. And ASEAN as an organisation plays a really vital role in driving regional economic integration and reinforcing the rules and norms that are really important for stability and prosperity. Jody mentioned my previous role as heading our Indo-Pacific strategy branch, and ASEAN really sits at the heart of Australia's vision for the Indo-Pacific. And as ASEAN set out last year in its ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it wants a region marked by peace, security, stability, and prosperity. And we do too. Secondly, the impact of COVID-19. So I don't need to tell any of you that we're living in unprecedented times. I think we're seeing unprecedented use of the word unprecedented at the moment. But the pandemic is the most significant stress test of our global and regional trade and investment environment that we've seen in recent times. ASEAN economic ministers have acknowledged that regional trade and investment is likely to suffer a deep contraction. And this sentiment is, of course, borne out in AustCham survey results, which Chau will talk about shortly. So it's undeniable that this has been a difficult year and there are more challenges ahead. All businesses have had to adapt quickly and many have been hit really hard. So we need to be clear-eyed, and I think the AustCham surveys show the clear negative impact on Australian businesses. But it was encouraging to see that such businesses were more optimistic in the latest results compared to April. And the new survey identifies some opportunities that Australian businesses have found, including improvements in work practices and new opportunities through e-commerce. So Australian business has an important role to play in Southeast Asia in this difficult time. Our business community has long-standing deep ties to the region, and many of the panelists and participants are an important part of those really deep ties. In 2018-19, two-way merchandise trade exceeded 92 billion Australian dollars, and Australian companies provided high-quality services across the region. While COVID-19, of course, means that the current picture isn't quite as rosy, Australia's strengths in areas like quality education, agricultural products and energy will help Southeast Asian nations recover from the economic effects of the pandemic. Our education sector has led the way in rapid broadening of digital delivery options, but we've also seen a rise in demand for digital health solutions. And demand for premium Australian agricultural items, goods and beverages has largely held up across the ASEAN region, although supply has been challenging. Third, efforts of ASEAN towards economic recovery and the way we've been trying to support. So ASEAN is really working to support the region's economic recovery, including through development of a comprehensive recovery plan. And with the pressure COVID-19 has put on supply chains, ASEAN's Hanoi Plan of Action on Supply Chain Connectivity lays out practical ways that ASEAN members will work together to support regional economic integration and supply chains. Australia is lending support to ASEAN's agenda, including through a couple of packages announced recently by Foreign Minister Maurice Payne. This included new funding for its successor to our flagship Economic Development Programme. We're also funding a project on supply chains and logistics under the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity 2025 and supporting ASEAN to develop a fourth industrial revolution strategy. I'd also note that as countries grapple with the responses to the economic impacts of COVID, multilateral rules and norms are under increasing strain. A tangible example is the trend of rising trade protectionism. Australia remains committed to working with others in the region to support the multilateral trading system. 15 countries remain committed to signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, this year, an agreement with ASEAN at its centre. RCEP countries account for almost a third of the world population and GDP, and RCEP will deliver a range of benefits, especially in areas like services, investment, and digital trade. Importantly, signing RCEP will send an important signal of support for trade liberalisation and rules-based trading arrangements during this time of significant global trade tensions. Australia, ASEAN and New Zealand will also soon begin negotiations to upgrade the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area, or ANZFTA. This remains one of the region's highest quality FTAs. We want to ensure that ANZFTA remains contemporary and relevant to business and contributes to COVID-19 regional economic recovery. Finally, I'll just say that as we navigate the uncertain economic waters ahead, the work of private sector leaders like AustCham ASEAN remains crucial. I'd like to commend AustCham ASEAN for its important work this year in tracking Australian business sentiment in response to COVID-19. I look forward to hearing from you all today and to working with Australian business and ASEAN as my role as ambassador to ASEAN to advance our shared goal for a peaceful, secure, stable and prosperous region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think there could end up being a few questions people might like to put to you, so let's watch the question panel on the right. Thanks so much. It's really interesting, I think, to hear about that ongoing work that the Australian government is doing with across the ASEAN region, and also noting the importance of that integration across the region. And I think that's something that is we're realising is more critical than it has been before in many ways. So thank you for that keynote speech. And now for the panellists. Our first panellist today is Chau, somebody I know very well and have worked with quite a lot. Chau is the president of AustCham ASEAN. She's also the in her spare time, she's the executive director and transaction counsel for SC Capital Partner Group with responsibility for transactions across Asia. She's currently the vice president of AustCham Vietnam and is due to remain the president of AustCham ASEAN for the remainder of 2020. As a qualified lawyer, Australian lawyer with international and Vietnamese law experience, Chau also sits on a range of advisory committees, including the Australian Vietnamese Young Leadership Dialogue and RMIT School of Business Management Industry Advisory Committee. Thank you, Chau. I look forward to hearing about the survey, which I've worked closely with. It's great to see it all come together in one package. So thank you. I'll hand it over to you now, Chau. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. And thank you, Ambassador Nankervis, for your kind words in regards to the work that we do at AustCham ASEAN. It's been challenging, but hopefully with the results of the survey, it will help guide business as well as government policies in trying to assist businesses throughout the region. Just to let you know, AustCham ASEAN undertakes an Australian Business in ASEAN survey to better understand the perspectives on local as well as regional business conditions in ASEAN. We use these results of these findings to assess key opportunities as well as guides to setting the key advocacy priorities for AustCham ASEAN. In May 2020, AustCham ASEAN launched its 5th annual Australian Business in ASEAN survey. This survey included an overlay of the impact of COVID-19 on businesses across the region, following a COVID-19 impact survey undertaken in April. In July 2020, we undertook a further COVID-19 impact survey, which provides more details on which to assess the ongoing impact of COVID-19 across the region. So I'm actually here today to present to you those results, and as I said, to guide us through how do we, as businesses, go through this period. Firstly, we asked the business what they expect the impact of COVID-19 to be on their businesses across ASEAN in the next 6 months. Unsurprisingly, it was found that COVID-19 will have a negative impact on businesses in the next 6 months. But we note, and as the ambassador noted, it was more positive and improvement since April. 76% of respondents foresaw a negative or a strongly negative impact on their businesses, but there was a 20% decrease in the number of respondents who said that the pandemic would have a negative impact in their business. A small number of firms anticipated a somewhat or a strongly positive impact on their business. These firms came from a variety of industries and countries, and we'll go through that detail shortly. Around 2/3 of firms in healthcare and environmental service foresaw a somewhat or strongly positive impact in the next 6 months, and did 1/3 of those in the property, construction, infrastructure industries across the ASEAN region. Similarly, those who thought the pandemic would cause somewhat or a strongly impact were hailed from many countries. 1/3 of the respondents in the categories were from Thailand and the Philippines. The industries that were most positive about the impact of COVID-19 on their business in the next 6 months were environmental services and healthcare. The industries that were most negative were travel, hospitality and entertainment, as we suspect, marketing and media and communication as well. Firms operating in Myanmar, Brunei and Laos were most strongly anticipating a negative impact from COVID-19 on their business in the next 6 months. In Brunei and Myanmar, 100% of firms expected a somewhat negative or strongly negative impact on their business, followed by 81% in Laos. Firms operating in the Philippines were most optimistic about the impact of COVID-19 on their business in the next 6 months, with 34% of firms anticipating a strong positive impact over that period. We wanted to also have better access the impact that COVID-19 is having or anticipated to have on economic integration across the region. When asked whether the pandemic would slow down economic integration across ASEAN, 73% of respondents predict a slowdown would occur, 17% are not sure, while 9% do not think a slowdown will be likely. Almost half of the respondents do not anticipate that such a slowdown would be bad for their businesses. In 4 markets, close to half of all respondents were optimistic that the effect of a possible slowdown in their economic integration, ASEAN economic integration. With Singapore, 50% of firms said a slowdown would not be bad for their business, closely followed by the Philippines, Cambodia, and Indonesia. In 2 markets in particular, Myanmar and Laos, 3/4 of respondents were pessimistic about the effects of the possible slowdown in ASEAN economic region integration that would have on their business. So the impact on existing trade barriers throughout the region. When asked which existing barrier to trade and investment have made worse by COVID-19, restriction on service offerings and cost of operations were cited as the most negatively impact existing barriers. Across industries, the trade barrier that respondents were most concerned about was cost of operations, with 3/4 of industries ranking this in their top 3. This was most clear in healthcare and ICT, where 80% of those were worried. The second most important trade barrier was restrictions on service offerings, where 11 out of 16 industries listed it amongst their top 3 trade barriers. Businesses in the energy and resources were most worried about this trade barrier. This was then closely followed by worries about time and costs of import and export procedures, with over half of industries ranking this in their top 3. Concern was highest amongst respondents in the consumer goods and ICT sector. Many ASEAN countries shared similar concerns about trade barriers that's been exacerbated by COVID-19. 5 ASEAN countries selected restrictions on service offerings as one of their top 3 concerns. It was a top concern for firms operating in Myanmar, Singapore, and Indonesia. 7 countries selected access to skilled labour as one of their top 3 barriers to trade and investment. Firms operating in Vietnam were most concerned about this trade barrier. Cost of operations was also a concern for 7 ASEAN markets. It was a primary concern shared in 3 markets for Brunei, Philippines, and Thailand. Time and cost of import and export procedures was ranked as important by firms operating in 5 ASEAN countries, and it was a primary challenge for Malaysia. And as you can see, this just summarises the different concerns in each industries that they have across ASEAN in terms of the impact of COVID to their business. We also thought it was important to assess the future challenges across ASEAN faced to better understand and assess our advocacy efforts across the region. Across ASEAN, 63% of respondents cited decreased demand in goods and services related to a change in business climate from COVID-19 as the greatest challenge facing their business in the next 6 months. 45% named increased logistical challenge between countries, while 36% named cash flow difficulties. When looking at the country's levels response, decreased demands for goods and services related to change in business climate dominated respondents' concerns, with it being ranked amongst the top 3 challenges for all ASEAN markets. The next most important concern was increased logistical challenges between countries, with all markets other than Laos selecting it amongst their top 3 concerns. 3 countries, Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Philippines, also listed increased logistical challenges within country as their top three. Cash flow was the third most selected option and was ranked amongst the top three for 6 countries. For Laos and Vietnam, this was the most important challenge. 3 ASEAN countries selected regulatory risks in their top 2 concerns, with 70% of Singaporean firms selecting this option. Businesses in the Philippines were the only ones to select compliance with HR regulations as their #1 challenge, with over half firms voting on this choice. So now we're going to look at business opportunities that businesses consider to have arisen as a result of COVID-19. And as the ambassador noted, e-commerce is one where, and we all know, I think as time evolves, interestingly, 71% of respondents agree that business opportunities have arisen and emerged from COVID-19. The adoption of more efficient working practices through virtual meetings, online tools were cited by 39% of respondents as such opportunity. And the second most common was, of course, greater staff productivity through flexible or remote working. The majority of respondents, 70% of them in fact, expected a negative impact on their firm's 2020 revenue. Around 24% expect revenue to decrease by 10 to 25%, while 21% expect revenues to decrease by more than 50%. Overall, 12% of firms foresee COVID-19 as having no impact, or in fact, positive impact on their 2020 revenue. These firms come from a variety of countries and industries. Travel, hospitality and entertainment, as we know, are the most pessimistic industry about their 2020 revenue. 70% of firms in this cluster expect their 2020 revenue to decrease by 50% or more. Transports and logistics were the most optimistic sector about their 2020 revenue, where 40% of firms expect no impact on their revenue for this year. Firms located in Thailand were most pessimistic about the impact of COVID-19 on this year's revenue. Firms located in Singapore and Brunei were most optimistic about the impact of COVID-19 on their 2020 revenue, with 20% of Singaporean firms forecasting an increase in revenue. Indonesia has the highest proportion of firms that said COVID-19 has no expected impact on their 2020 revenue. Several industries expressed difficulties estimating the 2020 revenue, underscoring the debate about whether COVID-19 represents a challenge or an opportunity for firms. For example, over half of firms in ICT answered too soon to tell for 2020 revenue, as did around a third of those in other services. Firms in the Philippines in particular had trouble estimating COVID-19's impact on revenue, with half of their firms responding too soon to tell as well. One of the areas that we want to get more information on is how businesses use government support, both the Australian government as well as host governments, and what further support they thought could assist their businesses throughout the region going forward as the region looks to recover from COVID-19 impacts. When asked about 8 COVID-19 support measures in their host countries, a majority of respondents has accessed market information, visa, work permit advice, and general financial support. Most respondents who had accessed a COVID-19 support measure in their host market believed it was somewhat helpful or very helpful. For market information, over half said it was somewhat helpful or very helpful. Over 70% of those who accessed general financial support reported it was somewhat or very helpful. However, for another 5 trade policy measures, a majority of respondents said they did not access them or that they were not available to them. This number is the highest for supply chain support, where almost half said that they had not used this support measure at all. Respondents who had access to supply chain were also most negative about its helpfulness, with over half assessed accessing it, saying it was not helpful. Businesses in Cambodia reported the least amount of support measures from host government available amongst all countries surveyed. The most desired COVID-19 support measures across ASEAN was general financial support, with 80% of respondents selecting this in their top 3. It was top ranked for 4 markets: Brunei, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. The next most common response was visa and work permit guidance at 70%. This was most desired in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. 70% of respondents also placed financial support for SMEs in their top 3, with this being top in mind for Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore. Indonesia actually was the only country that ranked market information from government or industries chambers as the most desired support measure. Malaysia has the largest share of respondents valuing labour support, and Thailand the largest for valuing wage support. COVID-19 support measures that business utilised most from Australian governments were market information and visa work permit guidance. Support measures that were least utilised by businesses were labour support and general financial support. For those that accessed a COVID-19 support measure from the Australian government, most believed that it was somewhat or very helpful. This was led by 88% of respondents who accessed market information, and 76% of those accessed financial support for SMEs, rating it as somewhat or very helpful. In contrast, respondents who accessed wage support were most negative, with around half of them saying it was not helpful. And now we look at what assistance business would find most useful going forward. There was popular support for Australian government providing market information, with almost half of all respondents saying it would be helpful for their business in the next 6 months. The next most popular, again, as repetitive, would be the visa and work permit guidance, and then financial support for SMEs. Individual industries concerned generally tracked overall concern of those polled. The most desired form of support for 10 industries was market information, followed by 5 industries who most valued financial support for SMEs. The industry that most desired market information was energy and environmental services. The industry that most desired financial support for SMEs were consumer goods and marketing, media and communication. Visa work permits assistance were also high amongst those of most industries, with 63% of industries ranking this in their top 3. Supply chain support was only ranked as the most desired support measure in agriculture and government. So a huge thank you to all our 9 foundation member chambers of commerce and business councils across ASEAN for their support in disseminating the survey across their networks throughout this year. And finally, thank you to the Australian government through the Australia-ASEAN Council for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their support of this COVID-19 Impact Update July 2020. Thank you once again, Ambassador Will Nankervis, for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to meet the face that's going to be flying the flag for a long term to come. And also thank you to ERIA for co-hosting this event. If you'd like to know more about AustCham ASEAN, please reach out to our website or contact us. And I hope you find that useful. Back to you, Jodie.
Thank you very much, Chau. As someone who personally spent a lot of time working with that survey, it's so good to see we had so much data. It's so good to see it all pulled together and to get some really clear guidance on, I think for AustCham ASEAN, on the the areas for advocacy going forward, but also hopefully some really helpful information for the Australian government and host governments throughout ASEAN. So thank you. And I think there was a lot of data and information to digest there, but if anybody would like to see even more or read even more, there's further information set out in the report, which is available on the AustCham ASEAN website. So please, you'll see, I think it's already been uploaded onto the chat post there, but go and have a look at it. There's further information. So thank you. And thank you so much, Chau. That's great. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. John Ackermann. Dr. Ackermann is a founding director of PT Mitra Asia Lestari, a company focused on producing sound research, sustainable business development, and increasing leadership capacity in Southeast Asia. Dr. Ackermann is a recipient of an Australia Day Achievement Award for his work overseas and sits on the boards of the International Business Chamber in Indonesia and the Indonesia-Australia Business Council. As you can see with Dr. Ackermann's profile up there on the screen, he has been busy doing a lot of things. So I really think that you'll all agree he's very well qualified to share his perspectives on doing business across the ASEAN region. And he's got plenty of information to impart now. So thank you, John. If you'd like to start your presentation.
Jody, and thank you for those very kind words that you provided for me, and good afternoon panelists and also people attending this webinar. Really appreciate the offer and invitation to be able to speak today. Hopefully the title of this does provide you a little bit of insight about what I want to talk about today. It will be a little bit different, I think, from my former colleagues in terms of what I actually talk about, although I believe the message will still essentially be the same. But I want to talk about a few of the examples here in Indonesia specifically, and particularly those of businesses, examples of businesses working with government. Now, there's certainly been a lot of information about the challenges of the pandemic, and no doubt every person listening has been affected in some form or some manner, either experiencing the direct health consequences of the disease or the economic ramifications of lockdowns and restricted movement. But no doubt the impacts and challenges are far and wide. Ambassador Nankervis, I probably should have made this slide out of unprecedented instead of the word challenges, but I think people will get my meaning. And as I mentioned, as my colleagues have sort of already talked about some of the challenges and opportunities through ASEAN and provided results of actual surveys, I don't want to spend too much time covering the same ground, but rather provide particular examples of issues to the agriculture sector, both past and present, and an example of some of the innovation that's helping businesses plan to overcome some of these issues. And hopefully towards the end of this presentation, I will have painted a picture that leaves you thinking a little bit about how we might approach the future. So I'd like to sort of start by bringing everybody back to a table that Chau presented from the Australia-ASEAN Chamber survey, showing significantly negative sentiment at the top of the table for agriculture. Now, it's easy for me to understand negativity surrounding the travel, hospitality, entertainment, and to some extent the marketing, media, communications, but it is a little bit surprising re agriculture and really a little bit concerning because of its particular importance to all of us. We don't go very far without food, and at this point I would actually point out agriculture is often neglected. And in talking about the agriculture sector, because restaurants are certainly related, hospitality, etc., I wanted to show a couple of pictures for everybody taken last Friday in South Jakarta, specifically for this presentation. If anybody's moved through Kemang in Jakarta on a Friday afternoon, you know that this is not normal. Restaurants are now closed for dining in, people are moving around less again, and with the recent tightening of restrictions, it can actually be seen, and certainly impacts are going to be felt again economically for some of the food sector. Now, the first example I wanted to go through relates to some work we did with the Australian government's Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, work that actually started before the pandemic, but focused on understanding agribusiness priorities, issues and trends to better align research programs with industry, while still working with policymakers and smallholder farmers. And while the emphasis was not on COVID issues, in talking to industry from producers through processors, distributors onto retail food service, of course, COVID issues arose as we were talking to people this year. And given what we've heard to date, and certainly from Chau's presentation, I don't think the results will surprise anyone. So some of the COVID issues that came up for the agriculture sector, specific to Indonesia, were logistics and transportation issues, and particularly storage and delivery facilities focused on cold chain. Obviously, food's got perishable products, and so that's a particularly important aspect. And if you need to store products because supply chains aren't working, that creates a problem. Commodity price fluctuations were a concern as demand dropped off on particular products, say chicken. Feed supplies slowed down a bit, and so aspects such as corn dropped in prices for particular regions focused on that. Certainly within restaurant, hotels, retail areas, safeguarding the health of employees and customers were particularly important. Maintaining business continuity at this particular time period, trying to deal with the COVID crisis was important. Supply chain capacity and aligning that demand with the ability to actually get supply was a particularly important point. Improving online and digital networks and the rush to develop e-commerce platforms. Lots of delivery services were set up rather quickly. Shops were closed for short periods of time while they actually established some sort of self-delivery mechanism. Postponing future development, i.e. opening new shops or actually investing in new infrastructure. Improving the safety of payment systems with the rush in development of e-commerce platforms, of course, being able to actually receive money and give security to the customer was an important point. And bringing back consumer confidence given the initial consumer changes when the COVID periods first hit. And developing innovative ideas as well. That was particularly important, and particularly so for chefs who were operating under a reduced income, therefore reduced expenditure, challenges in terms of some of their supply, and so being able to still provide high quality food for customers, even though it might have been in delivery, being very innovative with that was particularly important. So the previous slide was actually about the COVID issues, but the purpose of this particular work was actually a lot more long-term focused, and it was set up and established prior to COVID pandemic actually hitting. Now, so the finding out what some of the key focus areas and issues for agribusiness was, they were focused on these aspects: developing effective transport and logistics mechanisms, reducing food losses, improving quality, ensuring food safety, improving linkages between producers and actual markets, including farmers and out to distributors, buyers or retail, improving technology and access to technology, developing and improving consumer trust, providing easier access to finance and capital, and certainly for the farming sector, keeping youth involved. A worldwide phenomena for the agriculture sector is our farmers are generally, on average, getting older. So I wanted to bring these things up and actually come back to Chau's presentation before in terms of what are the greatest challenges to the business over this 6-month period compared to the general focus of the agriculture sector. And you can see some of these issues that have been around a long time for the agriculture sector were also become particular issues under the COVID situation. What this actually explains to me is that what the COVID situation should remind us of is that some of the known and historical challenges actually became critical shortfalls during this particular disruptive event, or could again during disastrous events. So with everyone's anticipation to go back to normal, or what people are now calling the new normal, I just want to again note that in the agriculture sector, there are a lot of challenges prior to the pandemic, and for a commodity which we can't go without for more than much than a few weeks. Question for everybody, was normal actually good enough? For me, I'd say no. Which brings me to sort of the opportunities and the innovation. And again, a lot of attention, particularly and importantly to health and education. And with talk of smart cities coming up more and more, I want to point out something from a lift out from a Jakarta Post article back in October last year, which brought together all of the elements of an interconnected smart city. And if I actually had an audience that I could engage with here, I would be asking and interacting the very simple question, what's missing from that particular diagram? Food. One of the things that people often, and I raised this in one of my earlier slides, agriculture is often misrepresented or forgotten about. So what are some of the answers to innovation and agribusiness, especially again focused on the aspect that current challenges and historical ones are focused around the supply chain. So this is a tool that CSIRO, our Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, has developed in Australia, Transit. And noting Ambassador Nankervis's comments very early on in his keynote speech, talking about ways that industry and government and research can actually work together. Here is a second example that I'm showing today of some of that interaction and P2P partnership. So through funding from the Australian government and working in partnership now with the Indonesian and Vietnamese governments, we're working on bringing this particular tool and this innovation to those countries. Now, the model itself is a series of layered information and mathematical models, including roads, ports, shipping lanes, production areas, storage facilities, milling, processing facilities, information and data on demand, and costing structures across all of that. And what it does is it allows you to actually map agriculture product movement from paddock to plate and provide a figure or an estimate of cost. And additionally, it allows simulations to be run, for instance, disruptions, border closures due to pandemics, infrastructure planning, or more localised aspects such as natural disasters, including floods and earthquakes. I won't go into this, and I know I've actually on purpose made this a little bit small, so hopefully people can't spend too much time trying to read it. The development of this particular tool and model is a complex one, and believe me, there are much, much smarter people behind the mathematics modelling than me. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about it in general towards the end, but I'll skip on and talk a little bit about an example so it makes a little bit more sense. Now, to date, we've managed to already map all the roads in Indonesia, all the rice production through Java, all the milling areas and facilities, the storage areas, the markets, and the demand. And we've got a costing model of transportation for this. And it's not just roads, it does actually include shipping in this. So we can get a really good picture of the transportation routes from the production areas to the areas of demand. And in this particular example, in the map on the right, you can see the road from Semarang to Jakarta is particularly important. The blue line actually estimates there's approximately 500,000 trucks using it to transport rice alone from Central Park through to the demand area of Jakarta, all at a cost of approximately $1 billion Australian a year just to move rice from, as I said, the eastern part of Java through Semarang onto Jakarta. Now, some might argue this is fairly intuitive, but the model has actually mapped every single road segment, and for my Indonesian colleagues, right down to Jalan Tikus. And so you can drill down with this particular model as well, right into specific regions, distribution centres, storage depots, feed mills, to work out critical infrastructure issues or needs. And importantly, and especially in the context of COVID, mapping isn't the only use of this technology and technological innovation to identify what the current system looks like, but you can actually run simulations showing the impact of a disruption. So the example here is that same road that's particularly important, moving rice from the eastern part of Java where the production facilities are, from Semarang through to Jakarta. If it was flooded, and we have been told that historically it certainly has, and was unable to be used, the model itself will determine the next best route. That which is in green on this particular figure. Now that alternate route adds an additional 43 kilometres, takes an additional 71 minutes. Now for each truck, that actually increased the cost of about 100 Australian dollars per trip. We know there's about 2,000 trucks just shipping rice alone that moves through that area. So you're looking at about Australian $200,000 per day losses just for rice for every day that road is broken because of a disruption. That doesn't count other commodities, other agriculture, fuels, etc. Now, the reason I wanted to draw your attention to this is because obviously through the discussion so far, supply chains, transportation and logistics come up again and again through the challenges of COVID. But again, these were issues for the agriculture sector before. Innovation was being developed, and possibly okay for me to say, albeit slowly, to provide a better understanding of the use of freightways and shipping, but also to run simulations for better planning of infrastructure. And in the Australian context, this model, and given that it is actually quite sophisticated in its development in Australia, was actually used in the COVID setting to determine some of the vulnerabilities of altered demand, costs, and whether any critical points along the supply chain would be in need of attention. Particularly the case for Australia, where there were border closures, and in the instance of temporary closures of facilities such as meat plants. The meat industry was able to use this to understand the costs, changes, and that altered demand, and be able to react a little bit quicker. So I'm coming to the end of this, and what I wanted to highlight in all of this is when we think of the COVID challenges, we should reassess whether some of them were in fact known and historical challenges. Were they issues utilising short-term solutions to simply get around them for now? And are we developing innovations to deal with the current challenge with a long-term picture in mind? i.e., what if there are actually other disruptions? Are we ready? Or are we even ready for a combination of events, another pandemic, a border dispute, climate change, environmental issues? Well, on that particular point, I'll just put this slide up very quickly. There are predictions with increased populations, increased food demand, will run out of water. Now that's going to create a particular impact for the agriculture sector. Are we ready for that, or will we find some of these solutions after some of these issues have already hit? I think we often walk a little bit of a fine line with solving some of the big issues with solutions that are okay for now. And the pandemic has really indicated to me we weren't ready. We were working on some of these solutions, and I know we are currently literally and figuratively staying alive for now, but we should be prepared to be thinking long term, so we don't just go through this particular period and try and head back to normal or find some new normal, but rather we become a little bit better prepared for future disruptions or a combination of future disruptions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. That's really interesting and as you said, a different approach than the previous speakers, but all aligned, and really I think has left me thinking about what you've just spoken about. I know we've also received a couple of questions that have come in directed to you, so you're not yet finished. So thank you very much, and thanks for agreeing to present today. Our final speaker for today, before the Q&A session of the webinar, is Dr. Intan Murnira Ramli. She's a policy fellow in ERIA's Policy Design Department and provides advice to ASEAN policymakers, including senior economic officials, leaders and ministers. Her areas of specialisation are in ASEAN economic integration, trade and services, investment, dispute settlement systems and regional free trade agreements. Dr. Ramli holds a PhD in international trade law from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. It's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Dr. Ramli. So I'll hand over to you straight away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody, and a very good afternoon to everyone. And also thank you to AustCham and also ERIA for inviting me to share a different perspective from talking about the importance of good regulatory practices in mitigating pandemic to businesses in ASEAN. As you can see, ASEAN has been one of Australia's top 3 trading partners, totaling to $63 billion in 2019. In 2019, ASEAN's main export, if you see to the right side of the slide, it's generally include minerals, vehicles, products under nuclear reactors, and electrical machinery and equipment, while ASEAN's imports from Australia have traditionally been dominated by primary products and minerals. Whereas if you see from the perspective of ASEAN's trade in services with Australia, it has risen steadily, reaching to 31.3 billion Aussie dollar in 2018 to 2019. And this was dominated by travel, transport, telecommunication, and information services. However, trade policy uncertainty and geopolitical tensions somehow has led to sluggish economy in 2018 to 2019. Come 2020, this year, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we suddenly see the world economic outlook and growth has come down to a downward spiral. The pandemic has had a more negative impact in the first half of 2020 than originally anticipated by IMF forecast in April and also June. Global growth is projected to be above 0% only by 2021, with ASEAN and Australia having 6.2 and 4% growth respectively. I have gone through the report on the COVID-19 impact on Australian business in ASEAN, and I find that it is very useful, I think, to the businesses to actually take stock in terms of what are the issues and what are the problems that is actually impacted by the COVID-19. But we somehow also to be realistic that some of the issues before us are actually not really actually COVID push rather than COVID led. So these are the very reality that we actually have seen. And from the chart before you, we could see that cost of operations are seen to be the most negatively impacted by COVID-19. Whilst restriction on service offerings remain the top concern of top 5 ASEAN member states, we could see that somehow the chart signifies that sectors are usually regulated by independent economic regulators, such as customs, central bank, inland revenue, to ensure market efficiency and the quality, reliability, and affordability of services. Second, the need for increased coordination between regulators and other actors and their contribution to the definition and implementation of emergency measures demonstrates the relevance and importance of the role of regulators. And lastly, the need for agile regulators with innovative action for flexible and responsive regulation for the post-crisis period. So with that, ASEAN has not been sitting on its laurels. I think somehow the concerns of businesses have been transmitted to the government leaders, and this is where the ASEAN Economic Ministers has agreed on the 4th of June 2020 to the Hanoi Plan of Action to implement the declaration of the Special ASEAN Summit on the Coronavirus Disease 2019. This demonstrates ASEAN's determination to identify and address trade disruption caused by COVID-19, and hence we need to remain cognizant of the action plans in each of ASEAN member states to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the supply connectivity, such as, first, sharing of information and best practices in handling the pandemic, business consultation, support, and public-private sector collaboration efforts to respond to the challenges to economic sectors and business sectors. Second, enhancing and strengthening engagement with stakeholders, such as the private sector, by having them as significant partners in strengthening regional supply chain. This is to instill investment confidence, promote business opportunities, and enhance supply chain connectivity. Third, to build on existing trade facilitating platform in ASEAN to promote and support supply chain connectivity and ensure the unimpeded flow of goods and services and facilitate the environment for possible shifting of production business models. This is where you see that there are issues about cost of production, and this is where you can actually utilize this action plan. And 4, looking at promoting the use of science, technology, innovation, digital economy, and provide mechanism to facilitate customs clearance and processing to allow businesses, especially the MSMEs, to continue operations while ensuring responsible business practices, observing relevant rules and regulations to empower their business to access the regional and global market and stay competitive. And lastly, initiatives such as to continue the implementation of the ASEAN Work Programme on e-commerce to support businesses using technologies and digital economy to continue operation. These are generally noteworthy initiatives by ASEAN itself, which resonates with the importance of good regulatory practice to be institutionalized in ASEAN. So where do we go? How would business actually deal with this? So given that a regulatory environment has substantial impact on performance of companies, ERIA's research has found that reforming government's workings remain a massive challenge. So progress towards reform remains incremental, whilst regulatory review could be implemented systematically, applying reduction of unnecessary burden to businesses methodology as developed by the Malaysian Productivity Corporation through stakeholder engagement to review and improve business unfriendly regulation is much easier. Here you see a diagram of stages of stakeholder engagement, which shows multiple steps which can be initiated to identify problematic regulations, sectoral wide and along the value and supply chain, and suggest options as solutions. Informed regulatory conversations between the stakeholders can somewhat review and reveal and expose issues which can be potentially addressed without the need of an elaborate regulatory reform. Thus, through the process of mapping and robust consultation, changes can potentially be agreed at a minimum cost, bringing a real, tangible, and immediate impact to businesses. One successful case study which I can relate is to Malaysia's sewerage works approval process. In that issue, it demonstrated how the process of a regulatory and permitting agency addressed complaints of private sectors stakeholders. The reframing of the issue results of the intense internal discussion within the agency and the associated accountabilities of alternative options enable the agency to develop a more cost-efficient, risk-based approval processes that the private sector stakeholders welcome. Well, I can share some more, but I think this is for now. And to conclude, in finding solutions, it is important for us to actually think about how to engender regulatory conversations among the regulators and the businesses. Good regulatory practice remain essential and must continue during and post-pandemic. It is noted that during this crisis, we saw that regulators have brought in a drove kind of thing, short-term emergency measures to address immediate threats to market operation and continuity of service, increase of vulnerable customers, and the financial security of operators. Be that as it may, such emergency measures must remain time-bound and based by science and evidence, accountable and through independent decision-making. In the longer term, transparent monitoring and phasing out of those measures should happen to maintain the predictability of ASEAN member states' actions. Post-implementation review for maximum accountability and perhaps abbreviated RIA, or what you call regulatory impact assessment, will help to maintain trust in a government's regulatory decision-making. At all times, businesses should have the opportunity to respond Businesses should have the opportunity to consult government to respond to any crisis affecting market structures and operation. In this, effective stakeholder engagement process will enhance governance, promote stability and productivity, while at the same time protects public health and safety and the environment. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramli. I think it's very interesting and absolutely critical that businesses and governments start thinking about different ways in which to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. So I'm sure there'll be lots more questions coming your way. So if anyone in the audience does have a question still that they'd like to post in the chat function, please do so, because we're going to move to Q&A now. If the question is directed at a speaker in particular, you could please also pop that in. That will help us direct the questions to the right people. So obviously now we move to the Q&A part of the webinar. We already do have a lot of live questions that have come in, but as I said, this is your last chance. Pop the questions in there and we'll try and get to as many as we can. I guess this is where I'd like to introduce you all to our Q&A moderator, Ms. Julia Marson, who's the Director for Strategy and Partnership at ERIA. I've worked a lot with Julia in the last few months, and it's been a pleasure, and we'd like to thank you very much for helping arrange this webinar today. So if I can hand it over to you now, Julia, to moderate the Q&A session. And obviously, once again, just encourage the audience, if you do have any more questions you'd like to ask, there's still time, so put them in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody. I really enjoyed all presentations, so I look forward to the interesting conversation we're going to have right now. And also let me thank Jody for the excellent organization leading to this webinar. But because we have the privilege to have with us the newly appointed ambassador to ASEAN from Australia, that is our keynote speaker for today, I would like to start with a question for him. And I would like to ask him how he sees the outlook for ASEAN-Australia relations in an environment affected by COVID-19. Ambassador Nankervis, may I invite you to take the floor again?
Thanks very much, Julia. Thanks for the question. I think the bottom line is that the outlook is really good, and hopefully the pandemic will really bring us closer together, and I see that happening already. A few points. The first one is that the ASEAN-Australia relationship is really long-standing and very deep. Australia is actually ASEAN's very first dialogue partner, and as I mentioned before, ASEAN's really at the heart of Australia's vision for the Indo-Pacific. The second point is, I think that the pandemic is showing again just how important ASEAN is to Australia, but also hopefully that Australia is important to ASEAN as well. So what happens in ASEAN really directly affects us and Australia's national interest. And, one example is the fact that, of course, ASEAN's our second largest trading partner as a bloc. So ASEAN is going to be really important to Australia's economic recovery. So it's in our interest that we really support ASEAN's response to the challenges of the pandemic. So we're really in it together. The next point is to say that we are really working with the individual governments within ASEAN countries, but also within ASEAN as an organisation, and working with ASEAN as an organisation is my role to help address the pandemic. A range of things I could point to. The first thing is that through our new Partnerships for Recovery policy, Australia has pivoted all its development programs in the region to assist countries to ensure health security, economic recovery and stability in our region in the midst of the pandemic. I've spoken about Australia's support for FTAs in the region, the answer to upgrade, but really importantly, RCEP as bringing us closer together and sending a signal about our commitment to economic openness at this difficult time. And then finally, we've really stepped up ministerial engagement. So the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, held a special ASEAN-Australia Foreign Ministers meeting, co-chaired by Malaysia, in which she met with all her ASEAN counterparts and announced a package of support for ASEAN's efforts to address the pandemic. She met the week before last with a range of her counterparts, again in various formats, East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, and in a bilateral meeting. And she announced a further package of measures there. Of course, our Trade Minister has been very engaged with his counterparts through the ASEAN Economic Ministers meetings. And I think COVID-19 will really be a major focus of discussions between the Prime Minister and regional leaders at the EAS and other ASEAN-related summit meetings to be held later this year. So the bottom line is, I think the pandemic has shown how important we are to each other and hopefully brought us closer together to cooperate towards addressing the crisis and working towards economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, I see that some questions are coming. We will address a few questions to the speaker, but we may take, towards the end, we may come back to you again. Thank you again, Ambassador. So the presentation from John has already generated quite a buzz throughout the chat box. So I'm going to ask to John a couple of questions and then use these questions to also take comments from both President Chau and Dr. Intan. So we have questions about transit. That was a very fascinating example. And some of the participants are asking you, John, whether the transit example can be applied to other ASEAN countries, and notably, for instance, Myanmar. And also another question for you that's perhaps a little bit provocative. The question is whether you think that the transit project is benefiting more the Indonesian government or the farmers. So John, what can you tell us about these two questions?
Thank you, Julia, for those questions, and thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. Transit itself is quite a complex tool, as I think you could probably see from the presentation, and I rushed through it very, very quickly. And just to add, it's taken Australia about 8 years to develop it through not just engagement with government agencies, because transportation, agriculture, trade, manpower type ministries need to be involved in this, public works, etc., but also state-based agencies need to be involved, but particularly the industries need to come in. It's very, very data heavy. So it actually, much in the way Intan's talking about engagement with industry, trade, regulatory aspects, this particular tool needs a lot of engagement with a lot of people. So for Indonesia, we really had only just started to develop it here with some case studies to start building the model itself, and we are probably a couple of years away. We are also doing the same in Vietnam at the moment, but more on a localized area as opposed to looking at the whole country. We have examined other countries within ASEAN to look at it, and certainly possibilities. Again, it comes down to data access and being able to spend the time and effort to talk to lots of people. In terms of the beneficiaries, it's everybody along the supply chain. So it's the farmers, it's the industry, it's the millers, it's the feed providers, it's the transport companies, it's the retail end. It allows people to be able to plan a little bit, because you can drill right down into specific areas and start asking some questions about whether you can do things a little more efficiently. For government, it's particularly important in terms of planning. If you've got $100 million to build some infrastructure, what are the types of infrastructure you want to build? And so the model can run scenarios where, in actual fact, it'll offer, it'll run the scenario itself and provide the financial benefit for each one. And of course, it becomes a political decision as to which one of those actually gets chosen, depending on what area it might fall in. So the beneficiaries are everyone along the supply chain, and we've still probably got a couple of years to go to fully develop it beyond a couple of case studies for Indonesia.
Thank you very much. So we saw that these questions are somehow related to the importance of innovation, adoption of new technologies, also as a way to, let's say, overcome the challenges posed by the pandemic. So I would like to follow up with President Chau and ask her, whether she saw, in AustCham over the last few months, this strong recognition that this is the way to go, and in a sense that businesses should become even more proactive in adopting innovations and new technologies in the coming months ahead. President Chau.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Yes, definitely. I think the survey, this survey goes across to all businesses around the region. So definitely innovation, or to apply different ways of doing business, has to be the way forward until we overcome in terms of the technicalities or the difficulties of traveling. So myself, I sit in Vietnam. And so, yes, for businesses in Vietnam, the biggest thing now is how do we, and I think it applies to every other businesses around the globe, is how do we continue to be in touch with our counterparties, as well as our, so depending on which sector we're in, but in terms of connectivity, how do we maintain that to try and keep the productivity still at the same level, the new norm, the same level, or at some sort of level, such that it can be maintained and overcome as we get through this period. So here in Vietnam, everybody, and as the survey rightly showed, is that the biggest concern for Vietnamese businesses, or those Australian businesses in Vietnam, is visa and work permits. How do you bring someone in? And it's even just working with authorities of getting solutions for people to come in has to be innovative. It has to be a different way of working, because nobody's going to sit there in front with you. So it's been, I think for all of us, everything is new. New in the sense that whatever is put forward can be tried, can be tested, and if it works for as long as it can, and we'll continue to use it. So I, personally speaking from Vietnam, I think that's very true. And if you apply that thinking throughout the region, it would be the same for other businesses throughout the region. Yeah, that's my view.
Thank you very much. And so to follow up, also Dr. Intan, she has mentioned agile regulation to support innovation and the adoption of digital technologies. So can you elaborate a little bit on that and tell us what you think that ASEAN can do in that respect?
In looking about ensuring that you are responsive and agile in regulators, meaning that in terms of looking at how you can support in terms of facilitating e-commerce transactions, maybe some, looking at rules and regulation that actually regulate data transaction and data localization. Those are the considerations that might have to look at in terms of facilitating SMEs and also MSMEs in coming up with their digital platform. So those it's like there's a lot of shake-ups that you have to actually have in terms of considering what is actually needful at this juncture in order to facilitate e-commerce transaction, given that a lot more businesses now would actually be able to be sustained if you actually have a digital platform. For example, like in Indonesia, where our organization is based, we see that because of the current decision of the government to actually disallow dining in, so restaurants have to come up with a lot of innovative ideas, like having rice boxes in terms of being able to cater for people who actually would then be able to take away the food from the restaurants. And in this, those businesses or those cafeterias or those restaurants must be able to access to a platform where would actually facilitate, for example, some of them actually be reduced to using WhatsApp, IGs, and also Facebook to actually deliver their services. So this is where somehow the regulation needs to look at how this can actually be facilitated, and especially in terms of even payment systems has to be innovative enough to actually allow payment through basically e-payment, like for example, like the OVO in Indonesia, or maybe payment through Gojek, what you call GoPay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Intan, also for reminding us that actually there's a lot of innovation now happening also in so-called traditional sectors. You know, we are talking about restaurants or the agricultural sector that are currently being very innovative in many cases in many different countries in ASEAN. But now, because we are approaching the end of our time, I would like to go back again to our keynote speaker, Ambassador Nankervis, and ask him about what is the Australian government doing to support Australian businesses in the region during this period, and also what is the Australian government doing to support ASEAN responses to and recovery from COVID-19. Ambassador Nankervis, again, the floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you very much, Judy. Apologies for that. So to the first part of your question about how the Australian government is supporting Australian business, I mean, the government really recognises that conditions are tough for business right now and is trying to respond. And given time's limited, I'll just talk briefly about 3 programs. The first one is relevant to some of the issues John mentioned around supply chains, particularly for agricultural products. And the mechanism is the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, which is designed to assist exporters of low-volume perishable items to get from Australia to the overseas market, recognising the pressures due to collapses of flights and so on. So the Australian government recently boosted funding to this measure by about $242 million, and it has supported hundreds of flights and thousands of tonnes of Australian produce to be exported. The second one is the Export Market Development Grants Scheme, a financial assistance program for SMEs to develop export markets, which was boosted again last financial year to its highest level ever. And the third is a new COVID-19 export capital facility under Export Finance Australia. The value of that is $500 million to assist exporters whose businesses have been affected by the pandemic. Of course, we're also working on broader trade liberalisation issues, which will assist, and there are a range of FTAs in place. Of course, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership came into force in July, and I mentioned RCEP already. And then we're also using our network of diplomatic missions to keep businesses informed about what's happening on the ground and to provide support. So that will be a focus for me and my team, and will be going forward as well as our bilateral embassies. Thanks for the second question about what the Australian government's doing to support ASEAN's response. I'll be brief, but this allows me to answer a question that I've seen that's come up during the chat about vaccines and whether Australia and ASEAN might work together. So we're doing a lot of work to support ASEAN's response. I mentioned some packages that have been announced by Minister Payne, one worth $23 million in June and another worth $60 million a couple of weeks ago. They're really focused around 3 themes: health security, stability, and economic recovery. I won't go through all the elements, but the health security theme includes a new health initiative to help the region better prevent, detect and mitigate communicable diseases. And under health security, I can say a few words about vaccine in response to the question. So ensuring equitable access to vaccines, is a really important priority for Australia. And it's a very big priority for ASEAN countries as well. And for that reason has been, one of the key focuses of discussions between our ministers in recent times. And there's been commitment to work together towards that safe and equitable access. Australia recently announced an additional $80 million contribution to the Gavi COVAX facility advanced market commitment, which was particularly directed at helping countries in the Pacific and Southeast Asia access a vaccine when one becomes available. And that was in addition to Australia's existing commitments to the COVAX facility of hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, Australia is also supporting ASEAN's response through a contribution to the ASEAN COVID-19 Response Fund. Just on a couple of other areas, on stability, we have a new political security partnership. And on economic recovery, the Minister announced a successor program to our flagship program of support to regional economic integration and connectivity. So my team is going to play a really important role in delivering on a lot of those initiatives. And I really look forward to the opportunity to help ASEAN recover from the pandemic, which will also help Australia as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost at the end, but before giving back the floor to Jody, Hachiyama-san, the Chief Operating Officer of ERIA, is there anything you would like to ask and share with us?
First of all, today, thank you very much for all speakers and all participants. And we had a good presentation on the Q&A session. And I believe that this is our common understanding that the role of the partner countries for ASEAN, such as Australia, is important to strengthen the supply chains more. And for being the more resilient supply chain, as I mentioned, that developing the both physical and especially the digital connectivity is essential. And I think that this is a good chance to advance digitalization in all sectors for coping with the coming pandemic, after post-pandemic era. And anyway, I hope today's webinar is very useful for all the participants. And lastly, that I thank all speakers and all participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hachiyama-san. And now back to Jody.
Thank you very much, everybody. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I'd just really like to say thank you to all of the speakers today. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nankervis, for making the time to make yourself available, for being so candid in your responses, and welcome to the ASEAN family. Thank you to all of the other speakers for your fantastic presentations today. I think we really covered a wide range of topics and information flow. It was great. So thank you. Thank you to Julia and ERIA for co-hosting this with us. It's been a very smooth process, I think, which is great. And just a couple of sort of housekeeping things to wrap up. As we said earlier, it's being recorded. It has been recorded and will be made available on the ERIA and AustCham ASEAN website. If anyone has asked questions or has questions after the webinar is over that you would like raised, feel free to email them through to me and I can send them off to the right, to who I think might be the right person. And otherwise, thank you everyone for joining today. We look forward to working together in similar webinars going forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.